Most of you know Dada quite well, and if you don't, he is, he's a man of many talents. So he is a meditation teacher, an artist, a musician, does speaking engagements, and works with companies with meditation. And we're so fortunate to have him here with PLT. And so today he's going to be talking about hope and optimism. And thank you again, Dada, for being here. And I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks. Very good to see you and some of my very good friends who seem to be here with us this morning. Or at least it's morning here in California. And I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a moment. That's what I want. Okay, you should be able to see this, and I want to make it big. And here we go. No, I don't really want that. There we go. Can you see that? That's not sharing properly, is it? Is it full? I want it full screen, but it's not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you can see your bar up there, your search bar.
I don't want. Give me this 1 second.
Besides that, Dada, it is pretty, I mean, it's covering most of the screen, so.
Okay. That'll do. Okay, so this morning I'm going to be sharing a few thoughts about the power of hope and optimism. And I want to tell you first why, or how I came to this. I was talking with a friend he's from Brazil, but he's working in Germany a couple of months ago. And he works with a company that helps provide funding or find funding for organizations that are helping to fight climate change or to reverse climate change. So there might be nonprofits or there might be green companies or startups, but they need money and his company helps them to find that. And I asked him, what's the main problem your people have, the people on your team? And he says, without any hesitation, he said, despair, which sounded pretty serious. And of course, I realized that they are always getting the latest information from the scientific world on the climate change situation. And it's because they're hearing that all the time, it's making them feel that this is a hopeless battle, that we've effectively already lost, that it's too late, that that global temperature might heat more than 2 or even 3 degrees in our lifetimes, which could be, well, if it goes well beyond 3, it's cataclysmic. So it could be. So they feel that they're fighting a hopeless battle, which of course is tremendously disempowering. I mean, it's pretty hard to fight a battle that you don't believe you might at least be able to win. So, and so I was talking with him, and he mentioned this, and I thought, oh my God, that's a problem that I've come across before. When I was in Australia in the 1980s, I was working with a lot of activists who were fighting a slightly different battle. It was more to do with anti-nuclear and the peace movement and so forth. But again, they felt that they were up against forces that were way more powerful than them, and that the trajectory was pretty much irreversible of going towards a worse state and with a very, very dire, large-scale consequences. So it's a very similar problem from a psychological, emotional point of view. And I actually started running programs there as a kind of stress management for activists, and a part of it was helping them to remain inspired about what they were trying to do, because what they were doing was something, very noble and not very well rewarded, at least in monetary terms. So I thought, oh my God, I could take that content and those ideas, and a lot of it was music, and refurbish that and create a program for organizations having to deal with global warming and climate change. And then in a couple of other conversations I mentioned this, and two people said to me, one of you's here, that this might be relevant to the medical community, because they're often fighting very, very difficult, apparently unwinnable battles. So I saw, okay, there's a need for this, and I started developing this. So this is actually the first time that I'm presenting this in some sort of new version, kind of in hopefully a coherent form. So there you go. That's what I'm doing here. I hope you find it interesting. So let's see what happens next. So in some of my discussions about this, we're trying to get clarity around what actually is hope and what is optimism, what's the difference. And I think I summed it. I got some clarity on this, I think. So hope is a feeling, and we'll look at this a bit more closely later on, because there's a Sanskrit word for hope, which is asha, and it describes a feeling that comes from the heart chakra. And I found that very interesting. And in fact, I said I was going to introduce my guitar more fully. This lovely instrument, I give my instruments names, and you can't see it because I'm sharing the screen, but you saw it before. My Taylor's the brand, but I call my guitar Asha, because I think her job, because guitars are obviously females like ships, her job is to inspire hope and awaken hope in the hearts of humans. So that's what I feel about hope. And then optimism is kind of a way of looking at the world and focusing more on the positives than the negatives. And we often have that choice. So, of course, the two are related, and they kind of feed one another in a sort of positive feedback loop. If we feel hope, we're more likely to be optimistic. And if we're optimistic, we're more likely to feel hopeful. But they're not quite the same thing. But I think they're both important. What we think, what we believe about the future, about our lives, what we imagine to be likely to happen to us actually has a huge impact on us. And I love this quote from Paramahansa Yogananda: if you think you will fail, you will fail. If you think you'll succeed, you'll succeed. Either way, you are right. Sometimes it's better not to be right. So, of course, he's one of the great yogis who really was a pioneer of bringing meditation and yoga to to the Western world generally, particularly the United States. But he was very aware of the power of thought and the influence of thought on on our lives and on our own motivation, certainly, but also in not exactly magical ways, but quite surprising ways. And this effect is very well studied in medicine, and it's sometimes called the placebo effect. You might have heard of that. You might have experienced it, where there are many examples, and there's been a huge amount of research into this, where people believe they're going to become well, and they do. Or conversely, sometimes people are incorrectly diagnosed, and they think that they're really seriously ill. They might think they might be told they have cancer, and they become worse. They become more ill. So this placebo effect is actually taken into account in drug testing, and it's a major influence on the outcomes. If people believe that the medicine they're getting is real medicine, they're more likely to get better, even if it's just a sugar tablet. And they have to use this kind of blind testing when testing new medicines to make sure that to try and eliminate the variable of people's expectation, which is a major real factor. This man, Dr. Bruce Lipton, he's the one on the right. The one on the left is just the book cover, probably his most famous book. He lives in Santa Cruz. I interviewed him once. brilliant man. He's done a huge amount of research. He's a cell biologist, and he's actually identified at a cellular and molecular level the mechanism that enables phenomena like the placebo effect. And he sort of says, well, it's if we believe something, if say we believe that we're going to become ill, or that we've got cancer, something serious like that, that stimulates certain emotions, and those emotions trigger the release of enzymes and the whole biochemistry, and that makes us sick. So there's actually a physical process or correlate that flows out of our belief and affects our bodies and our minds. So it's not just that with the world of thought and belief and the mind is intimately integrated into our bodies through our nervous system and our endocrine system and our cell biology. And he studied this very deeply and written and lectured on it widely. And it's very real. So, yeah, ideas are important. Our beliefs and our perspective are very important. So we're going to take a little look at bad news and good news and why stories matter. The Asha Vritti, remember Asha means hope and the Vritti means this feeling, and how spiritual practice relates to hope and optimism, and a few takeaways. That's the overview of what we're going to zoom through today. And of course, my greatest inspiration, it was Sri Anandamurti, who taught me basically all the important things I know. And he said, I'm an incorrigible optimist. So you know where I stand on this. And this is what he was always very, very positive. He used to ask us for a good news report. So he was very focused on, he didn't want to hear the bad news. He wanted to hear the good news, and you'll see why in a minute. Some of you may have at some point in your life come across some sort of doom and gloom predictions about the end of the world. I grew up during the Cold War, and I went on my first anti-nuclear march when I was 5 years old. I was being brainwashed by my parents to be a good little activist. And we were brought up in this sort of environment where many of us believed, I certainly did, that it was almost inevitable that human beings would destroy the world through nuclear war in my lifetime. And up until I was 19, I believed that. And it didn't, I sort of, just thinking about how I responded to that, it didn't make me consciously sort of depressed or unhappy, but it sort of made me feel that there wasn't a great deal of purpose to existence. It made me, there was a sort of sense of meaninglessness in the background. And of course, that affects different people differently. Weirdly, it didn't, at least on a conscious, not that I remember, it didn't sort of, as I said, didn't make me feel depressed, but it did make me feel kind of vaguely sad about humanity being so deeply foolish and reckless and unwise. But that changed dramatically when I had a very powerful spiritual experience, and I felt, from being an atheist, suddenly I was not, and I felt that there was a higher power and there was a sense of purpose. And ever since then, I've believed, I had a completely different perspective. I've been convinced that that's not going to happen. Now, as it turns out, the Cold War ended. Okay, there are still nuclear weapons, but the likelihood of that happening has reduced, diminished dramatically. So, yeah, my take on it is that the end of the world is probably not nigh. There are all kind of other predictions. I've actually heard people prophesying the end of the world numerous times. Here's one of my favorites. This is a picture taken from my car. I did stop. apparently the world's going to end on May the 21st in 2011. You may have noticed that also didn't happen. This so-called prophet was paying a lot of money, off his followers' money, for these billboards all over America, and it's absurd. The Bible apparently guarantees it. Well, go figure. Some of you may be familiar with the Mayan calendar depicted on the left in this beautiful diagram. Turns out it resembles the Oreo cookie remarkably closely. According to some interpretations, not the Mayans, other people, this calendar ended in 2012, and people assumed that this meant that the world would end in 2012. So we have all lived through the end of the world multiple times. I can only conclude that it's good for our health. And I did a little research into this medical miracle, and I discovered that I've actually lived through the end of the world more than 100 times. I think it's 105. So humans have this negative bias. We're biased towards pessimism, and we'll look at why in a minute. I'm not saying pessimism's all bad. Bertrand Russell had this great insight, great philosopher, English philosopher. He said, we need the optimist and the pessimist. The optimist invented the aeroplane, and the pessimist, the parachute. So yes, I don't believe in blind optimism, or what they call toxic positivity. That can also be a problem. Ignoring danger is problematic. And then I wouldn't describe this as toxic positivity. It's just another example of how wrong even the smartest people can be. This was Elon's prediction, a little over optimistic, or perhaps just hype. Tesla vehicles will be capable of traveling autonomously from Los Angeles to New York by the end of 2017 without a single touch. So that didn't happen. But here we are 6 years later, and it's getting close. I mean, we do have cars driving around San Francisco without a single touch right now. Legally, amazingly. So, yeah, pessimism and optimism, a little perspective on that. Okay. So my thought on prophecy, at least, is that it's an art best practiced with the benefit of hindsight. Okay. But stories matter. And the basic reason why we are subjected to so much negative news through the mainstream media primarily is because it makes money. And the reason it makes money is because we are hardwired to remain alert for danger. And this is what kept our ancestors alive, and they passed on their genes, and hence we are here. So it's not a bad thing, but it doesn't adapt well to the modern environment, where we have access to the news of the world every minute of the day, and there's always going to be bad news of some sort. And if we choose to focus on that, it creates a very negative and distorted picture of what's going on. It's not real. It's a result of our negative bias. So we have this, it's called confirmation bias. Given the nature of social media and our ability to choose which kind of news we want, and then the algorithm says, oh, this human likes this stuff, and they keep feeding it to us, or it keeps feeding it to us. This makes money for all kind of organizations, but it erodes our hope and optimism. It takes away our power to do anything about whatever problems we're facing. So yeah, bad news, just think about it. How does it affect your mood? You wake up in the morning, okay, it's a nice sunny morning, you're in California as usual, and then you hear that there was, an earthquake in Chile and 4 people died. Or, that somebody makes some dire prophecy about global warming based on some research. It's not a new problem. We used to worry about saber-toothed tigers, but they were a rare occurrence. We didn't hear about them eating our friends every day. And as I said, fear of saber-toothed tigers was a very useful, very, very useful instinct. But it's not useful if we keep stimulating it with information that actually is not relevant to us or doesn't affect us directly, certainly not in the present. I'm going to tell you a few positive stories. And when I was talking to my friend in Germany, this is what came to mind. I thought, okay, when I was a kid, I was taught, and I came to believe that nuclear war in my lifetime was inevitable. That's almost certainly wrong. Not definitely, but very unlikely. I was also told much later when this was in 1984, I went to the Greenpeace office in Adelaide, Australia, and I was told that blue whales were almost certainly going to be extinct, that they're biologically extinct and they're going to die out as a species. And that was irreversible because the gene pool was so small and so forth. 5 years ago, I was in Los Angeles. I went whale watching and we saw some blue whales in the water, a mother with a baby, super cute 30-foot long baby. And it turns out blue whales are increasing. Their numbers are increasing in health. And humpback whales, their numbers now are actually greater than they were in the 1500s when whaling really started commercially. So that dire prophecy turned out not to be true. In the 1980s, some of you may remember, if you're as old as me, you may remember that there was this hole detected in the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is really important because it protects us from harmful rays from the sun. And there was a hole in it, a big one. And they found out that it was being caused by chlorofluorocarbons, which were used in air conditioning and refrigeration. And there was a worldwide ban of their use, which was implemented really quickly because this was way quicker moving than global warming or climate change. And the consequences are already being felt in New Zealand and Australia because that's where the hole was and we were getting sunburned. And now, today, some people are dying from cancer as a result of the long-term effects of that. However, and there was a real fear that this chemical reaction to the chlorofluorocarbons, that's a hard one, going into the upper atmosphere, that the reaction started, they would spread and become uncontrollable, and that we would lose the ozone layer and fry as a planet. So there was a fear of that. What happened? We stopped using these chemicals, and within a few years, the ozone layer had repaired itself. We don't see that in the news because it's not scary and it doesn't sell websites, it doesn't sell attention. But there's good news out there. And this wonderful man, Paul Hawken, I had a conversation with him. He's a yogi, I discovered. He wrote this incredible book, Blessed Unrest, highly recommended. That was quite a few years ago. He's now doing extraordinary work with a big research team, addressing solutions to global warming. And they've got a whole schema, very detailed, very well-researched scheme, multi-pronged, showing how this can be done cost-effectively and in a very, very real way. And he's been working on this for years. So this book is about the number of people and organizations all across the world trying to make the world better and dedicating much of their lives to it. And he started counting them. And that was his big research project. Over 10 years, he counted more than 3 million organizations, not people, organizations, each consisting of thousands of members, all of them trying to address climate change, species extinction, social injustice, racism, income inequality, all these things, all these problems. And these are all like people dedicating themselves to this cause. He said it's the biggest movement for social and environmental good in the history of the world. Nobody's aware of it because it doesn't have a name, but it's growing. And he gave this amazing TED talk about this, which kind of made him famous. Anyway, worth a look. So there is good news out there. So I'm trying to be an incorrigible optimist, following the great example. That's my perspective. Quickly, something on Asha Vritti. It's not a guitar. My guitar is called Asha, but the Vritti is this feeling. You might see, well, in this little diagram, each of the chakras is symbolized as a lotus flower. The heart chakra, you can see there, has 12 petals, and each of them represents a certain feeling or emotion called a vritti. One of them is the Asha Vritti, the hope Vritti. So the hope is centered in the heart, and this can be stimulated by certain spiritual practices, particularly chanting or kirtan, or anything that awakens this feeling of limitless love, spiritual meditation, being in spiritual company, spiritual retreats, and especially where there's a lot of chanting. And all of this stimulates this feeling of hope and optimism, which leads to optimism. And once, Anandamurti once said that optimism is one of the only two measures of spiritual progress. Anyone know what the other one is? And I know I've told some of you this in the past. Let's see if anybody comes up with, what are the two ways we can measure spiritual progress? And I can't see the chat. Can you read that out to me, Krishna Prema?
Radius of love and devotion.
More or less. It's the actual words are the periphery of your love. So not quite mathematically correct, but close enough. Thank you. So yeah, I think the end of the world is probably not nigh. As I said, I'm working on being an incorrigible optimist. Takeaways. So you can recharge your hope through the Asha Vritti, your feeling of hope, with kirtan, spiritual meditation, and these other practices I mentioned, particularly group meditation and retreats and collective chanting. Secondly, don't believe all the bad news, especially predictions. Facts emerge and change with time. I once read a book called The Half-Life of Facts, and it shows how all the things we think we are true, and this is a lot of science included, turns out not to be true, or to be, in some ways incorrect, and it keeps changing. And focus on the good news. There's tons of good news out there. There's happy babies being born all day, every day that we don't hear about. There's, whales frolicking. There's all kind of good stuff happening. Doesn't appear in the news because it generally doesn't sell.